The Travels of Ibn Battuta, one of the world's greatest explorers. Tonight I'd like to tell you of a few of his adventures, and believe me, we'll only be able to get to a few. He went on so many travels and visited so many places that it would be impossible to include them all in one video. But I will get to as many of them as I can, and before I begin, let me just say that the moment I heard about this individual, I knew I had to include him in the Fireside Tales. He's been forgotten by a lot of the Western world, but his story needs to be told, and I feel great honor in doing so. So, to begin, Ibn Battuta was born in Morocco, and he decided, as part of the 5 pillars of Islam, that he was going to head off on his journey to Mecca. So he headed off, and first he went to North Africa, and then he headed off to Alexandria in Egypt. He began to go down the Nile, and on his trip down the Nile, he met a prophet who told him that he would go to India and China. And he was apparently greatly affected by this, and I think this was what caused him to, first gave him his inspiration to go off on travel and adventure. Anyways, he also stated that he saw the pyramids of Egypt, but we here at the Fireside Tales have doubts about this. His description isn't very accurate, and just take it with a grain of salt. If you want to believe it, go ahead. Anyways, he also shows a little bit of his character on these adventures, and when he wrote about them later on, or had his Juzay write the stories for him, he mentions how at one point he was going into a bathhouse and a bunch of the men were naked, and he became furious, and he went and told the leader, and the leader made sure that all of those men got on towels. Ibn Battuta was a very modest man. He also had many wives and many children. He could be very good to his children. He'd send them money and things like that, but most of the time he just got a wife and then divorced her, but that was actually pretty much the custom back then. Anyways, soon enough, after going to Jerusalem, another holy city, he arrived in Mecca, and he did some fasting and he did some praying, but he couldn't get enough of adventure, so he decided to head off and see more of the world. So he went to Oman, where he discovered that the slaves there were treated very cruelly, and he didn't really like the brutal treatment of slaves, even though he himself had many slaves, and I'm sure he wasn't against it or anything like that. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. Anyways, he also went to Turkey, and soon enough he arrived in India, where perhaps one of my personal favorite of his adventures happened. He met a king there known as Tughlaq, and Tughlaq was a rather cruel king. He was known to be very violent to anyone who disagreed with him or who criticized him. He would have them impaled on poles and have them paraded through the city to show everyone else what would happen if they disagreed with the king. Or he'd have swords put on the tusk of elephant and have the elephants hurl the body around, or he'd skin them alive. And anyways, even Ibn Battuta thought he was way too cruel and vicious for his taste. But he decided he'd get good with the king, as he had many other kings along his travel. So he sent him some camels and some horses and some slaves, knowing that the king would reward him even greater for these gifts that he gave him. Anyways, he was indeed right. The king rewarded him. He made him a judge over the land. And Ibn Battuta soon learned that although the king was a very violent man, he was also very generous. He had no problem giving away gold, and he would often take elephants out, and he'd catapult gold and silver out into the people, and they'd all wave their hands and grab as much gold and silver as they could. He didn't have any problem dispensing the wealth around. Anyways, Ibn Battuta, though, had a bit of trouble with the king, you could say. There was a Sunni wise man that he became friends with who criticized the king, and the king had the Sunni wise man killed, and Ibn Battuta knew that anyone who disagreed with the king or was friends with someone who disagreed with the king was to be killed. So he went off and he began to pray to Allah. Thousands of times, he himself said, hoping that he would survive. And he went to the king to ask for a trip to Mecca so he could get the heck out of there, but the king had different ideas. He wanted Ibn Battuta to go on a trip to China, so Ibn Battuta agreed, and he headed off. Anyways, along his trip, he encountered some bandits who ended up stealing everything from him except for his own clothes. And at another point, he encountered some more bandits and was just barely able to escape by hiding in a ditch. Anyway, soon enough, he reached Calicut, and there he liked it very much. He was treated generously. But anyways, as he was going out into the beach, he saw a great storm, and one of the ships sunk, and this ship had on it with it his wife and his children, and he was devastated, and he realized that he was poor, and that he was ashamed, and that he really had nowhere to go. But soon enough, he arrived in China. He didn't like it there very much. Too many people there that didn't worship Allah. But then he headed off to Syria, and that was when he got his first experience with the Black Death. Now, the Black Death, or the Grim Reaper, as we know it here in the Fireside Tales, was making its mark on the world, and Ibn Battuta thought he could out-travel it. So he began going around, but it seemed that Black Death was just as quick as him, and it was always striking wherever he'd go. So finally, he got a little bit homesick, and he headed back to his place in Morocco, only to arrive there and find that his mother had died. And this news made him stay in Morocco for quite a long time. But eventually, he got that adventurous streak in him again, and he headed off, and he visited even more lands. He traveled the Sahara Desert, but he was often disappointed that he wasn't treated better as he was before. He used to be honored by kings and emperors, and now everyone would come to him and they'd give him some yams, and that was it, and some water. And he was used to be treated as a guest of honor in these places. But anyways, eventually he grew tired, and he headed back to Morocco. And there he told the king there about his adventures, and the king said that he had to record these adventures so that the world could read about them later. And so he got one of his own scholars, Juzay, to sit down and listen to Ibn Battuta's stories, and so Ibn Battuta told them all. And perhaps he didn't visit all the lands that are mentioned here, even in this video, but it can be said for certain that there was no man that ever traveled the world quite like Ibn Battuta in a time that traveling wasn't the norm. And so I'm very glad to add Ibn Battuta to the ever-expanding world of the Fireside Tales. As always, sweet dreams and good night.